Welcome back to our daily Living Jewish Kitzur Shulchan Aruch class. Today we will be concluding section 72 of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch and beginning section 73 of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Let's start with our slideshow just to briefly revise what we've been speaking about. Pull it up on the screen. We're speaking about getting ready for Shabbos, or the importance of Shabbos, of not breaking Shabbos, the reward for Shabbos, buying food, being in the kitchen, making challah, having delicious food, setting the house up. Even the poor should invest in Shabbos as much as they can, stopping to work in advance, not having any big meals on a Friday, reading the Parsha in advance, showering, going to mikveh for men, cutting nails and hair, having a thought of tshuva on a Thursday night. Shabbos clothes. I mentioned it before, but it's worth dwelling on it again. Sometimes people forget that Shabbos is a really special time, and you should be wearing your most beautiful clothing. This is something that I know that back in Crown Heights in New York, come to shul and people are dressed beautifully, and over there I think the complaint is that maybe people are overdressing. But not at all. It's an honor of Shabbos, and we could learn from them wherever we are that we shouldn't be embarrassed of those around us, and to really dress beautifully for Shabbos. As for us men, we could put on our tuxedos and whatever other fancy suits that we have in honor of Shabbos, and the ladies as well. Final discussion, which we got into yesterday, was setting up foods to cook into Shabbos. So yesterday, we spoke about how there were some communities that believed that not only can't you cook on Shabbos, but you're not even allowed to let anything continue to cook into Shabbos. This isn't true. We can, but certain things need to be in place. I'll try to just touch upon. Yesterday, I spoke about things that we could have set up, like crock pots and hot plates and all different mechanisms to ensure that we're able to cook in a kosher and safe way on Shabbos. But let's just touch on a few important principles when it comes to allowing food to cook on Shabbos. I'll just touch on a few of them, and maybe at a later point we'll get into greater detail. So firstly, even if you put the pot on in advance, even if you put the stove on in advance, and you're not touching any fires or any flames, you wouldn't be allowed to put something raw onto a fire to cook on Shabbos. Sounds kind of obvious, but just addressing different scenarios, that means that if you have a hot water urn, even if it was on before Shabbos, you wouldn't be allowed to add cold water to it on Shabbos, because then you'll be cooking that cold water. You'll be making that cold water hot. Now, not only can't you take a raw product and cook it on Shabbos, but even something that is already a little bit cooked, you can't accelerate the cooking process on Shabbos. So what that means practically is if you've got a chicken soup on the fire or a chalent on the fire, you wouldn't be allowed to stir the pot, to stir your chicken soup or to stir your chalent, because then you're actually cooking on Shabbos, because you're causing the foods to cook on Shabbos. So that's an issue where you actually cause cooking to take place on Shabbos itself. As opposed to if you put the chalent on before Shabbos and it cooks by itself and you're not doing anything, then that's fine. But then what you do need is the blech, which we spoke about last time. So the first point was ensure that you don't actually make something get cooked on Shabbos itself. You can't on Shabbos do any activity that's going to cause something to cook. That's the first principle. The second principle is that if you are setting up something in advance of Shabbos, you need to have a blech, you need to have a reminder there that will prevent you from playing around with the fire. So what that means, practically speaking, is that you would not be allowed to put a raw chalent, semi-raw chalent on a fire on Shabbos, unless you have a metal tray or pan between the stove and the pot to remind you not to play with the fire. And if you do, if a person was to put a chalent straight onto the fire before Shabbos without any blech, then you're actually not even allowed to eat it, even though you did nothing on Shabbos. And the only reason that the blech, that metal tray, was there was to remind you. If you forgot to put the reminder in place, then you've actually violated a rabbinic law, which is that you are forbidden from putting anything on a fire without that blech in place. And were you to do that, then you're actually not even allowed to eat the food. Even if it was accidental, you wouldn't be allowed to eat the food until the amount of time it would take to cook it after Shabbos. If for whatever reason a person puts up a chalent and he forgets to set up a blech, he forgets to put up that metal tray that'll remind him, then he actually won't be able to eat the chalent on Shabbos, sadly. Unless the chalent was already mostly cooked before Shabbos began, or if there was a very raw piece of meat that was put into the chalent right before Shabbos. These are already more details that perhaps will be addressed in due course. So principle number 1 is don't do any action on Shabbos that will make something cook more. Principle number 2 is in order to set something up before Shabbos to cook into Shabbos, it needs to have a reminder, a blech in place to ensure that you won't play with the fire on Shabbos. That's principle number 2. Principle number 3 is that if something is on the fire from before Shabbos and it's fully cooked and you want to take it off the fire and put it back on. So even though when you put it back on the fire, you're not going to be cooking it because it's already fully cooked, the rabbis forbade us from doing something that looks like cooking it. By putting it on the fire, it's going to look like you're cooking on Shabbos. Which means practically that once you take your chicken soup or your chalent off the blech, off the fire on Shabbos, you can't put it back. Unless you never put it down in the first place. If you took it off and you held onto it and then you put it straight back on, then it doesn't look like you're putting something on a fire on Shabbos. It just looks like you're returning something to the fire on Shabbos, and that would be allowed. So that's principle number 3. Again, number 1, don't cause something to cook on Shabbos. Number 2, make sure to have your blech. Can't cook something from before Shabbos in a way that you don't have a reminder. And principle number 3 is that even something that's fully cooked cannot be placed on a fire on Shabbos. So similarly, on a Shabbos morning, if you have your hot tray and you decide that you want to warm up some kind of food that you want to warm up on a Shabbos day, I guess you want to warm up some chicken soup. The chicken soup's already fully cooked and you put it in the fridge last night and now you want to put it back on the hot tray in the morning to warm it up. So then there's actually, firstly, you're putting something on a fire on Shabbos, which is a problem. And secondly, if the chicken soup became cold, then there's another issue, which is that the cold water can be considered like it's reverted to a raw state, and that it'll actually be like you're cooking on Shabbos. So just to simplify things, the 3 general principles are, number 1, don't cook on Shabbos. Number 2, make sure that you don't set up your stove in a way that you might come to play with the fire. And number 3, don't put anything onto a fire on Shabbos. You could return something to a fire, but you can't put something on a fire on Shabbos. Based on those 3 principles, let's look at the next few halachas of the Kitzur, Shulchan, Aruch. Yeah. Okay, so this is halacha 17 through 21. Let's take a look. Where are we? Here we go. In halacha 17, he discusses that this is another concern, actually, a fourth concern I didn't mention, that if the pot is sitting on the actual coals, then you'll have to take it off before Shabbos, because otherwise, when you take it off on Shabbos, you're going to move the coals, and then you'll forget about cooking. You'll be doing a different violation, which is kindling a fire or putting out a fire as the coals move around. Then he speaks about a scenario of wanting to put food into an oven for it to stay hot into Shabbos, or to continue cooking into Shabbos. So he says in the oven scenario, if you're going to open the oven before the food is fully cooked, then then the air that comes in might flame the coals and cause the food to cook more, and that'll be a problem. But generally, that's not the mechanism we use today. We're not going to allow things, and ovens are quite complicated. We avoid using ovens on Shabbos. The only way that I recommend using an oven on Shabbos is if you put the food in before Shabbos, and you heat up the oven before Shabbos, and then you turn it off just before Shabbos, then the oven will just be a contained space that keeps the heat in and keeps your food warm. But you don't want to be dealing with ovens that are on Shabbos because there are various complications. So he continues to speak about ovens again in this next halacha. I'm going to leave it for now. Halacha 20, also more about opening the door of the oven and different mechanisms people would use. They would actually put like dough or some kind of sealant on the door as a reminder that they won't by mistake open the door before they're allowed to. This next scenario deals with another prohibition on Shabbos, and that is that you're not allowed to do hatvada. Hatvada means insulation. Insulation means that you're not allowed to take a pot on Shabbos and wrap it up in something to make it insulated. So you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. The reason is because a person would possibly use materials that would actually accelerate the cooking on Shabbos. So then therefore we said don't insulate with any materials, because once we allow insulation, some materials accelerate the cooking. So on Shabbos, you're not allowed to take a pot and wrap it in a towel, for example, to keep the heat. And even before Shabbos, you're only allowed to insulate in a material that doesn't produce heat. But, for example, if you had a pot on a hot plate and then you wanted to wrap it with a towel, then you wouldn't be allowed to, because you're insulating the pot in a place that the heat is continuing to increase. So again, insulation is to apply a covering directly to the pot. If there's space in between, it becomes less problematic from all sides. If you're going to take a pot and insulate it from all sides, then that's a problem. But it's to the pot, it's not to the food itself, meaning you would be able to actually take a piece of, schnitzel and wrap it in something to keep it warm. This prohibition of insulation is a prohibition to insulating the pot with what the food is within. So this problem is only if you completely cover the pot from all sides. But if you leave one of the sides opened, then that's not considered halachic insulation, and that would be allowed. So that's an interesting halacha, an independent halacha prohibition of the sages against insulation. Let's look at that inside briefly. So as Shabbos is approaching, when you put a pot of coffee into a hole in the ground to retain its warmth, mechanism they would use in those days, so that it can be used on Shabbos, and you cover it with pillows or similar things to keep it warm. So if you put your pot of coffee into sand, you can't completely insulate it. Why? Because sand is actually considered a material that intensifies the heat. It doesn't just maintain the heat, it actually causes the heat to accelerate. And we said that on Shabbos, you're not allowed to do any insulation. And even before Shabbos, you're only allowed to insulate it in a material that does not increase heat. So if you're going to be burying your pot of coffee in sand, even if the sand is not muktzah because you've designated it for use before Shabbos, it's a problem if it's completely buried in the sand, because then you've insulated it in a material that increases heat. But if you don't insert the whole vessel, but only part of it, and you cover the remainder with clothing or some of the things so that the whole vessel is covered on all sides, that too is forbidden. I guess because at the end of the day, the whole thing is covered. And part of the covering is by something that increases heat. So it would be just like wrapping a towel around the pot that's sitting on a hot tray before Shabbos. The pot is completely insulated and it's in a space where the heat continues to accelerate. The fact that the coffee pot is in sand, which accelerates heat, is a problem, even if it's not completely surrounded by sand, even if it has pillows on the top. So you need to do it in a way that the pot of coffee is inserted so that only 1/2 or 1/3 is in the sand and the remainder is exposed to the air. It's actually not insulated completely. There's actually different opinions about how much needs to be exposed in order to make it allowed. The Kitzur is saying that it should be a half or a third exposed. Some say even if it's just the cover is exposed, it's fine. You may then place a board or inverted vessel to cover the hole so that there is airspace between it and the pot of coffee. So as I mentioned, the prohibition of insulation for Shabbos is only when the insulation is right up against the vessel. But if there's a gap in between, which he's saying kind of proper empty pot to hold it back, then it wouldn't be a problem. So these are a few important points about getting your food ready for Shabbos. If you want to wrap, in modern terms, if you want to wrap your chicken soup in a towel before Shabbos, the towel does not increase heat, so you could do that. And that way your chicken soup will still be warm for the Friday night meal. But that's only if it's just in the towel alone. If you want to put it on a hot tray and then wrap the top half of it, or wrap it in a towel on that hot tray or on that stove, obviously in a safe way, then that's a problem, because even though you're doing it before Shabbos, one is not allowed to insulate a pot before Shabbos in a material that increases the heat. Now, final two halachos, 22 and 23, is before dark on Friday, meaning as candle lighting is approaching, you should gently ask your household, did you separate challah? And you should tell them to light the Shabbos candles. Now, why specifically did you separate challah? So this is a very different mitzvah. There's a mitzvah that any time we bake bread, a portion has to be divided, which would once upon a time be given to the kohen. Today it's burned. Now, until that portion of dough is separated, the whole challah is actually not kosher. Not kosher meaning that it cannot be eaten, and is not allowed to eat from it. If you forgot to separate dough while you were preparing the challah, then you could also cut off or separate part of the baked challah and do the mitzvah then. But if you completely forgot to do the mitzvah before Shabbos, then you're not allowed to separate challah on Shabbos. It's like a form of transacting, because it's to be given to the kohen. Since you're not allowed to separate challah on Shabbos, you would have made these fresh challahs and you actually won't even be able to eat them, because they only become kosher, they only become fit for consumption once you've separated challah. But if you don't separate challah, you can't eat it. So therefore, it's a good idea before Shabbos comes to kindly ask your wife, did you remember to separate challah? Because if you didn't, you're going to have a problem. The truth is that if it does happen that somebody forgets, there is a solution on Shabbos to be able to still eat those challahs, but it's a very, it's not an ideal solution. It's just after the fact, just so a person won't be stuck without challahs. There's a way that you could set aside a portion of challah, and then after Shabbos to separate challah from that portion that was set aside. But that's not something you want to plan on, and therefore before Shabbos comes in, you ask your wife two questions, or yourself two questions. Number one, have I separated challah? And number two, you tell your wife very gently, it's time to light Shabbos candles. I see we've hit time. Obviously, this should be done gently. The husband could also help with setting up the Shabbos candles. The final point, which is a very quick point, is that before Shabbos comes, we need to check our pockets to make sure that A, we won't be carrying on Shabbos if we'll be going outside of the Eruch, because if you have something in your pocket that's considered carrying, one is forbidden to carry on Shabbos. And B, to make sure there's nothing muksa, there's no donables or money or coins or wallets or phones or any gadgets which you're not allowed to handle on Shabbos. So before Shabbos comes in, part of the Shabbos prep is make sure that your pockets are Shabbos friendly. Thank you so much for joining and wishing you a wonderful evening.